Welcome everyone to Keep It Classy Tech. This video will go over updated settings for the LG G1 and C1 OLEDs. I'm going to show both accurate, or what's technically correct, settings, as well as what I think most people are going to prefer to use, especially if you're in a brighter viewing environment. So I'm going to be doing the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, as well as SDR, HDR, and Dolby Vision movie and TV content, and some motion settings at the end. So here with the adjust logo brightness, what that does is if it detects static images, it will dim the screen after about a 1 minute period. It'll start to dim slowly over the next 3 minutes by 15% if it's on low, 30% if it's on high. So I typically like to have that off so there's no dimming. For the Nintendo Switch, have the brightness turned up all the way and gamma set to 2.2. Leave the color depth at 55, the color gamut to auto. So for color temperature, technically accurate is warm 50, though I think most people are going to want a little bit cooler, so maybe try warm 30, especially on the 77-inch G1, which is warmer than D65. So for the Switch being 1080p, the sharpness at 25 works okay when using super resolution because it's a 1080p source, but you may want to go just a touch higher. 0 is technically no added sharpness, and neutral. But you saw I just turned on the OLED Motion Pro setting, so what that does is it's a black frame insertion, which gives you much smoother motion. So that's why we had the brightness turned up all the way to get as much SDR brightness as possible. And with the black frame insertion, it does dim the image a little bit, but it's still plenty bright enough and very smooth motion. So for the PS5, with HDR, everything should be at max for the brightness and HGIG enabled. Color again at 55. Color temperature, again 50 is going to put you closest to D65, depending which, if you have the G1, the C1, and which size, because they all have, they're all a little bit different. So that's the standard setting would be to use warm 50. However, like I said, I believe most people will be more comfortable around, say, warm 40, warm 30, maybe warm 20, and some people like even cooler than that. So on the clarity page, aside from the regular sharpness setting, none of that actually works when in game mode, even though the settings are adjustable, so there's no point in turning any of them on. Then you adjust your PlayStation HDR screen until the image fully disappears and all you see is white, and then you stop. The dark one should just be all the way down for pure black. And then this is showing how to set the input to PC mode. Doing so will force 444 chroma, and it also helps with color banding or posterization when playing at 4K 120 Hz with HDR in bright areas. So all you have to do is go to the input that you want and rename it to a PC. You just click on the little PC icon and then click save, and that's all you have to do. And if you want to reverse it, it's the same thing. You just click the dots, click edit, edit input, click on the icon, and then you can change it back. On the PlayStation, pretty much leave everything automatic, except for HDR you put only when supported. And then for RGB range, if you leave it on automatic, it will pick between limited and full. Typically the PlayStation would be using full. However, when watching movies or Blu-rays, then it would be limited. So if you're not going to be watching any movies or anything on the PlayStation, you can force full. But if you are, then just leave it on automatic. Alright, and then for SDR gaming on the PlayStation 5, make sure you're in Game Optimizer mode. And again, for pretty much all the modes, you always want to go and make sure AI settings are disabled. So OLED brightness, you're going to set to your environment to whatever looks appropriate. For contrast, it will clip colors over around 88, just a little bit, but if you go up to 97, that's about the clipping point for white. So if you really need more brightness in SDR, you can increase your contrast to about 95 or so, but it's better just to leave it at 85 if you can make do with how bright the SDR gaming is. And then for your screen brightness, if you're having too much crushed black or near black detail being lost, you can increase it a couple of clicks. And then your color depth, somewhere between 55 and 60, depending on if you've adjusted your contrast or not. Color gamut should be on auto, but for games like Fortnite, putting it to native doesn't really overblow the colors too much, and I think quite a lot of people will prefer the look of native. You can kind of see the difference there. It's on Samsung TVs, it's very neon-y when you would use native, but on the LG OLEDs doing native, it's not that much different, and it just gives you a little extra color saturation. Now if you go to the color temperature, again, warm 50 is technically what is supposed to put you closer to D65, except the 77 G1 is actually a bit different in that warm 40 to warm 45 is actually closer because it's too warm. But I still think for personal preference, a lot of people are going to want even cooler than that. And then if you do use native on the color gamut, then I would leave the color depth down a little bit, but if you use auto, then you can go up to 60. Just play around with those. Don't go too far on anything, or it will really screw things up. So again, clarity settings should all just be turned off, and it's a 4K source, so sharpness should be at 0. All right, over on the Xbox. So again, make sure it's in game mode. Right now I was just running both through the receiver, so that's why it didn't auto-detect the game systems. For SDR, you're going to pretty much do the exact same as the PlayStation. And again, just pick the color temperature that you like, although the warmer, the more accurate. And then for very non-realistic, just colorful games, I think native is okay, but if you're trying to keep it the way that it's supposed to look, then use auto. And again, make sure your AI service stuff is turned off. And then under Game Optimizer, you can play with the black stabilizer again if you have shadow details that aren't showing up the way that you want them to. You can access the OLED Motion Pro from this setting as well. I like to use it in SDR gaming for Fortnite or something. The boost mode will only work if it's 60 FPS or 60 Hertz, and it wasn't working with VRR or FreeSync when I was testing with the firmware that I had at least, but it also had the added benefit of increasing brightness in the high end as well as low end, so that would not just eliminate the shadow detail issues, it would actually overblow them and make them too bright. So then you would have to play around with the black stabilizer, white stabilizer, and brightness settings. So for the most part, I would say just don't use boost mode. Then on the Xbox, same thing, turn the black one all the way to the left. And then with HGIG enabled, adjust your luminance settings. If you go all the way left, it's 300 nits. Then you're going to go 10 clicks to the right, which is 800 nits, and then that's where it fully disappears. And you can see all the brightness stuff is pretty much just left alone, except HGIG is enabled. And if you turn it off, you can see the difference there that you lose in your highlight brightness, and then if you turn it on, it brightens everything else, but lowers, it's just leave it on HGIG unless you're going to have it properly calibrated. There may be a game here or there that you might want to just try putting the tone mapping to on instead of HGIG, but it's going to be a game-by-game basis and depends if the game supports HGIG or not. Again, the color temperature should be about 50. For this one, the 77-inch G1, again, it's too warm at 50, so 45, 40 is closer to D65. Alright, now here we are on an SDR movie. So at OLED brightness 57 to 60, somewhere around there. That should be fine for most people in a moderately lit room. The screen brightness is going to affect the black levels or near black levels, so you'll get a little more shadow detail, but you don't want to go too high or it's going to overblow and make things gray. Peak brightness does affect color accuracy. Only use it if you really need more brightness for SDR anyway. So if you max out your OLED pixel brightness and it's still not bright enough for your viewing environment, that's when you would use the peak brightness setting. But it should be plenty bright at OLED brightness of 60 to 100 with peak brightness off, but I'm just showing how bright it can get in SDR. With it off, it's about 250 nits measured, and with it on high, it's about 400, 450. Color depth for movie modes, and this is ISF Expert Dark and Bright. Filmmaker mode, cinema mode, those are like the main ones you want to use. So you can just leave the color depth at 50. The color gamut is grayed out right there on mine because I had calibrated it, but yours would be adjustable. You want to leave it at auto. And again, the same thing with the white balance. You put the color temperature to warm 50 for more accurate or more technically correct, but you may want to lower it to a little bit to if it seems too warm. Again, there's a lot of panel variance and variance between the C1 and the G1 depending on different sizes, so you just gotta put it to warm 50 and then adjust from there based on what you want. So motion settings are all personal preference. Again, OLED Motion Pro is the black frame insertion, so you'll see a little bit of flicker and loss in brightness. The cinematic movement setting is what I think most people probably end up using, or manually setting de-judder to 3. But to me, that's still too much soap opera effect. Cinema screen is your film cadence or 3:2 pull down, so you use that on a device that is not outputting 24 Hertz. Otherwise, you can get frame skips. The rest of motion stuff, again, it's all personal preference. And then here, so if you were to be watching sports or cable or whatever, you can just set it to standard mode and make some little adjustments here. This is where you're going to want it really bright. It defaults to the contrast being too high. So we're going to turn that down. Screen brightness, again, go up a couple clicks, maybe 53, because if you're talking sports and cable news, you're not worried about the black levels being a little too bright. You just want to see more detail. And then adjust the OLED brightness and peak brightness based on your room. So standard mode has color temperature way too cold default. So again, put it warmer and then adjust as you see fit from there. And then for sports and TV news and whatever, a lot of people like to have motion settings turned up, and you're probably looking at like a 720p cable box or something, so you can have sharpness up a little bit. You can play with the noise reductions, but I don't really ever see them doing anything at all, no matter the source. And cinema screen, you can have on or off depending on how you're watching your cable and sports content. And again, for sports, you probably want natural or smooth movement, as you don't need to really worry about soap opera effect, and you're just trying to see more detail as the ball goes through the air or whatever. And you can adjust with it manually if you like. De-blur is for high frame rate, 50 or 60 hertz content. De-judder is for 24 and 30. Alright, so that pretty much covers sports and cable. Now we're going to go to ISF Expert Bright. So the way I did it is I had cinema set up for the brightest stuff, lots of lights on, then ISF Bright for moderate or late night watching with a little bit of lighting on, and then ISF Dark for dark room. So you can do similar. I don't know if you're going to want to switch through settings too much, or switching picture modes throughout the day. So if you just want a good all-around set, I would just use ISF Bright and then set it how I am here, and then that's going to result in a measured 165-ish nits, and I find that to be good for a fairly dim to a fairly moderately lit room. And then for ISF Dark, I was setting this up for about 120 nits with gamma at 2.4 or BT1886. And this would be for purely darkroom viewing. The problem with going closer to the SDR standard is that's really for a really dark room, like you have your walls blacked out, you got a black ceiling, you got curtains, whatever. There's no light reflecting around the room, but most people don't have that. So that's why I like to use ISF bright at 2.2 around 165 nits, and found that to be comfortable viewing for just about everything, especially with older content from like the 90s, early 2000s, before 2.4 was standard. Anyway, so that's all your SDR modes. We're going to move into HDR and Dolby Vision next, and then finish up with a little bit of motion testing. And if you don't really want to mess with anything at all, you could just use filmmaker mode, and it's pretty much good to go out of the box. But it's going to be pretty dark for most people. Alright, here's Sweet Tooth on Netflix in Dolby Vision. So the correct thing to use would be Dolby Vision Cinema mode. So in Dolby Vision there is a difference between home and cinema that can't be adjusted, whereas in HDR they're the same with the same settings. So here we want dynamic contrast off, and everything else pretty much just left alone. And again, color temperature should default to warm 50. You can play with it a little bit, but you really shouldn't in Dolby Vision. And you really don't have to mess with anything. You just want to make sure your AI stuff is turned off. And then for Cinema Home, this is basically acting like HDR10 with dynamic tone mapping turned on. So it's going to raise the bottom and mid range, and not necessarily lower the high end, but if there's a scene that has a bright average picture level and a bright highlight, that bright highlight won't get as bright because there's not enough energy for the TV to push it when it's pushing everything else so much. So again, pretty much everything else though could be left alone. Just make sure the color temperature and color settings are correct, and then your motion settings are set how you want them. Again, if your device is outputting 24 Hertz, then you don't need Cinema Screen to be on. And that's it for Dolby Vision. So now on to HDR. HDR, we're going to be using Cinema or Cinema Home most of the time. You can use Filmmaker as well. Again, all these modes are going to be the same if the settings are the same. So technically, this is how you would have it set up correctly, with tone mapping off, color at 50, color temperature at warm 50. Under clarity, the only thing that I would adjust is smooth gradation. For HDR, I would probably put it low, possibly medium. It has a very, very minor effect, but it can help a little bit if you see color banding in the sky. And again, here we're adjusting the color temperature just a little bit cooler. Now for Cinema Home, we're going to set this up so that it's kind of like Cinema Home and Dolby Vision with HDR tone mapping turned on. I actually find LG's HDR tone mapping on with HDR to actually work a little better than the Dolby Vision algorithm with Cinema Home, in that it can still push the highlights pretty well, and it finds a pretty good balance. And especially if you're in a bright room, you're going to want the average picture level brighter. This mode does default to warm 30, so you can adjust that as you see fit. And here I'm turning on the smooth gradation. Technically it scrubs away fine detail, but I only see it do that if you put it to high. So low, possibly medium, but low should be fine. And then just set your motion settings however you like. And speaking of motion settings, going to use the really, really bad scene from Army of the Dead right here that looks like just horrible, and start going through some motion settings so you can see the difference that they make. This really is like a worst case scenario torture test for motion, so don't expect normal content to ever look like this. This is just a worst case scenario and showing what the motion settings can do to affect even really bad scenes like this. As I said earlier, I expect most people to use the cinematic motion setting as its least amount of soap opera effect with a little bit of smoothing, or if you're doing it manually, setting de-judder to around 3. However, again, if you don't like soap opera effect, you probably won't be able to use any of those motion settings at all, like myself. So I guess that's pretty much it. I'm just going to let this play out, and you can just see some of the changes taking place by the difference in the motion settings. So if this video helped you out, you liked the video, just a reminder, if you press the like button, more people will be able to find the video. I will have a G1 final review coming up pretty soon, and then moving on to some other TVs, so keep an eye out. Thank you all for watching. Hope you all have a good one. I'll see you in the next one.